All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see such a large crowd here. I know we're in for a really great talk. I've known Ricardo Herrera for many years. I met him first at the David Library while he was a fellow there. But before we get to that talk, I do want to make a few announcements for everybody to know about some of the things that are happening here at the Society in the next couple of weeks that might be of interest to you. So today you're having a lunch with Rick to hear about his book. And if you're so intrigued and want to hear it again, you can travel up to Bucks County, where he'll be giving this talk in Washington Crossing tomorrow night at the Washington Crossing State Park. On June the 7th, we're having an all-day symposium titled A Life in Letters, a celebration of Barbara Oberg. And if you don't know Barbara Oberg, she had a distinguished career as a documentary editor. She was the editor of the Benjamin Franklin Papers and the Thomas Jefferson Papers, both of whom, as I'm sure you know, were essential to the APS's early history. And so this is going to be a day in which we have a panel that explores Benjamin Franklin, another panel that will explore Thomas Jefferson, a third panel that will explore the future of documentary editing, and then a final panel to explore women during the American Revolution, which was also of great interest to Barbara. And then there will be a keynote conversation here that evening. We hope it will be a large audience to hear the new head of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Sasha Suda, in conversation with Cliff Fleet, the CEO of Colonial Williamsburg, to talk about the challenges and opportunities that historical organizations are facing today in the 21st century. So please check out that information online. After that, on June the 8th, we're having a two-day conference on women in science, achievements and barriers that builds upon many of the conversations and topics that are explored in our recently opened exhibition in our museum. So please check out information and register online there. And then finally, on June the 14th, a virtual event, a discussion entitled Old Ventura, about whom little is known. Music, Masculinity, and the California Missions. And that'll be a conversation online. So check that out as well. So I'm really excited to introduce Rick, and I thought I might take a little bit of a detour for a moment. Many of you probably know that this is my last event here at the APS. I'm moving on to the George Washington Presidential Library in a couple weeks. Thank you. But it's interesting to think about how this event in some ways is, for me, a full circle for me. My career in libraries actually began at the David Library of the American Revolution, where I was the historian, which was in many ways the job I have now on a much smaller scale. After that position, and by the way, the David Library's manuscript collections were on loan here at the APS. After that position, I was a postdoc at the American Philosophical Society, where my job was to go through all of their early American manuscript collections and create the first digital guide. After that position, I went to Williams College for a brief foray into the wilderness, but I returned as the librarian of the American Philosophical Society, where with the David Library Board, we were able to create a partnership that today is the David Center of the American Revolution. So personally, it's very meaningful for me to be able to introduce this talk today, and also to introduce the next head of the David Center of the American Revolution, and that's Brendan McConville. Brendan is a professor at Boston University. He's also a board member of the David Library of the American Revolution, and we're really excited to have him on board for the next couple of years to help the David Center chart its future path. But today we're here to hear about the past, to hear about feeding Washington's army, surviving the Valley Forge winter of 1778 with Ricardo Herrera. And I have to tell you that this book is an incredible read. It's vital, it's important. Many people think that Valley Forge has been done. What's there new to learn? And Rick has shown us how deep archival research and taking a new perspective, especially a perspective of somebody who understands the military, can really illuminate the past. Rick is an award-winning author. He's also the author of For Liberty and the Republic, The American Citizen as Soldier. And he's now completing a new book on A Most Uncommon Soldier, The Life, Letters, and Journal of Edward Ashley Bowen Phelps. He is currently the visiting professor in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College, and he has a BA from UCLA and a PhD from Marquette. He again was the fellow at the David Library, but his work has won a number of awards, including the Mercado Prize from the Society of Military Historians, and two-time winner of the Distinguished Writing Prize from the Army Historical Foundation, which I just think verifies how great his work is. So, Rick, do you want to take it over?
Thanks, Pat, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. What a great turnout. All of you want to hear about the Continental Army going for takeout. What a wonder. Thank you. Good. You're already laughing. I love you already. Hey, before I begin, a bit of boilerplate. Nothing that I say reflects the views of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or the United States Army War College, nor, in fact, do they reflect those of His Excellency George Washington, nor the Continental Congress. There, boilerplate is all done. So, this was a labor of love. I got to do something really cool. Anybody who's involved, even vaguely, with real estate, has a home, it's all about location, 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 as was Valley Forge. Valley Forge also, though, was a compromise. And like all compromises, nobody's happy. Yet it satisfies so many necessities. It scratches so many important itches that need to be scratched. And let me take you through a little bit of this before we move on. Some of the locations, obviously we're here in Philadelphia, Valley Forge, about 16, 17 miles to the north-northwest. The British Army had landed at Head of Elk, vicinity of today Elkton, Maryland, in August of 1777. General Sir William Howe's mission, destroy the Continental Army in decisive battle. Put an end to this rebellion once and for all, and by God, get it done before the damned French get in. Because we do not want to have to fight a much larger war. Let's suppress it before it gets even worse, even messier. There's another column that's coming down from Canada under John Burgoyne that they are supposed to link up. I won't go through all the nuts and bolts of it, but Howe lands with his army. They march up. They fight the one battle in all three of Delaware's counties, the Battle of Couch's Bridge. It's a delaying action. They work their way on here at Chad's Ford on the 11th of September, 1777. Washington is bested yet again in battle. And I'll tell you up front, in my view, George Washington, a phenomenal individual in many ways, a gifted strategic leader. In fact, I would argue that he's one of the best strategists, if not the best strategist in this war. He's an utterly mediocre tactician. He had 10 good days in his entire life, and it was the year before. When it comes to tactics, Sir William Howe, clearly his superior. When it comes to strategy, though, Sir Billy just doesn't have it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So, they continue. We get on the campus of Immaculata College, the battle above the clouds. Both armies line up. The Americans have got the high ground. Everyone wants the high ground in a fight. And the heavens let loose. And they're standing around with damp powder, looking at one another. Do you want to fight? No, I don't think so. How about you? No, I don't. Anybody want to charge up or downhill in smooth-soled shoes and go stickety-stickety with 18 inches of triangular steel, otherwise known as a bayonet? Nah, I'm not into that either. They just march away. Nothing much happens. The Paoli, the so-called massacre. Get that out of your mind. It's not a massacre. It's a brilliant tactical action that General Charles Gray launches, and he's able to humiliate Anthony Wayne, who, by the way, was not at all mad. Finally, almost finally, the Battle of Germantown. Washington had a penchant for overly complex plans, and yet again he did this, but also Mother Nature conspired against it, and also he made the mistake of taking Henry Knox's advice about Cliveden, or the Chew House, and got fixated on this. Don't leave an enemy strong point in your rear. Well, bad mistake, George. And that battle goes pear-shaped as well. So this army has managed to lose every fight it's gone into against the British Army, but the soldiers have held together. They still believe in the cause, whatever that is, because each soldier's motives are as particular to him or her in some cases as the individual soldier. And that's something that continues to this day. Washington will eventually take the army to White Marsh, about 14 miles east of Valley Forge. Beginning in October, he had been holding councils of war with his generals. And I teach about strategy. I'd previously taught about operations and higher level planning at the School of Advanced Military Studies at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. But he's asking his generals, what do we do? If it goes well, then what? If it goes poorly, then what? And these are things that your modern Army and Marines and so on do. They try to anticipate what may happen next and how to respond to it. And so Washington's going through this in his own fashion for the 18th century. He, by the way, is shouldering the responsibility of what would be done today by over a dozen officers and senior non-commissioned officers. His aides de camp and his secretaries are there to take orders, perhaps give suggestions, go out and gather information for him, but it's Washington who shoulders the responsibilities of 1, 2, 3, up to 4 staff shops that you would find in the modern army. Do we wage a winter campaign? Which sounds utterly nuts. Like, we've just lost every engagement we've been in, George. What are you going to do? Well, go back to his 10 best days. What had he done the year before? Think about it. Trenton 1, Trenton 2, Princeton. The Continentals, who are at the end of their enlistments, he has to pay the New Englanders a little bit extra to keep them on board. They're able to maul a Hessian brigade, then maul a British brigade, and then retire to the vicinity of Morristown in the Watchung Mountains. And Washington is essentially saying, go ahead, come and attack me. I've got fortifications and I'm in the mountains. I'd love for you to try it. The British are smart enough to know, no thank you. And this incites the Forage War in the Jerseys, causes the British to collapse their lines all the way back to New York. It's a brilliant 10-day action with incredible strategic results. Washington does all that. Why not this year? We've got an army now that is better trained, more seasoned. The officers have got more time under their belts. Why not? Well, okay, you can advance now. Thank you. Okay. Me and technology. Well, he does a personal reconnaissance. He rides out and he looks at the defenses of Philadelphia. Here, roughly, and I say roughly, along Vine Street, along the neck of the peninsula, a line of British fortifications. He's not going to cross the Delaware River. He doesn't have the watercraft, and the river's too wide, plus it's below the fall line. The river current is too fast. Schuylkill doesn't want to try that either. Not a good decision. Washington decides, oh, and by the way, we're right around here, the American Philosophical Society. Washington decides, okay, we're not going to do this. We're now going to go into winter quarters. Where do we go? Well, some of the generals, some of them propose Wilmington. Wilmington, Delaware sounds pretty good. It's nearby. It allows us to keep close watch on the British Army. It allows us to interdict, potentially, British shipping coming up the Delaware. The British, until the obstacles were cleared on the Delaware River, those obstacles, the chauffeurs de frise, and forgive my mangling of French, I can do Spanish, but French, no. There are fortifications on Mud Island, today Fort Mifflin, part of Philadelphia International Airport, and then across the river at Fort Mercer, Red Bank, New Jersey. They've got artillery covering these obstacles that prevent British shipping from venturing northward, venturing upward, up to Philadelphia. Instead, Royal Navy transports leased by the Treasury Department, by the Royal Navy, by the Army, have to actually pull in at Chester and then march overland about 15 miles or so, and they've got to be escorted by several hundred, upwards of 1,000 soldiers. Why? Because the Americans will attack those trains and get at them in order to hurt the British. Go after, as one of my bosses once put it, the soft, chewy parts. Next slide, please. Great. So, ultimately, the decision comes down, we're going to go to the Great Valley. Where in the Great Valley? Well, Valley Forge seems to be the place. Valley Forge, it sits on high ground. It's protected by a river to one side. What I want to ask you to do now is to look at this the way that I understand Valley Forge. Those of you who paid attention to the previous American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have no doubt been introduced to the terms forward operating base, it's also called a FOB, or a combat outpost, a COP. I will ask you now to think of Valley Forge for the rest of your lives as FOB Valley Forge, and I'll show you why. Take a look here at the entrenchments. They cover the major high-speed avenues of approach. In other words, the roads that enable armies to advance much more quickly. Scattered throughout, and I'll show you on some other slides, are redoubts or small forts. The artillery, you've also got here on Mount Joy, entrenchments. Next slide, please. Here's a slightly better one. Outer line defenses, inner line defenses on Mount Joy. And by the way, those defenses on Mount Joy, they're dug about 3/4 of the way up the hillside. That's something that I learned as a cadet 40 years ago. That's something that every soldier and Marine learns. You don't want to skylight yourself. George Washington's doing it. These fortifications, along with the redoubts, form a defensive system. This is a network. Each piece reinforces the other, but it also provides a defense in depth. So, should these be taken, there are places upon which to fall back. Why is it laid out like this? Because of the best military engineers in the world, the French. General Duportail sets all of this up for Washington. When that army marches in, it is now about the 4th largest city in British North America. Washington, the urban planner as well. Next slide, please. Because I do military history, topographical maps are great. So you can see how the land slopes away, falls away from everything. Here's the Schuylkill River. Pictures paint 1,000 words. Next slide, please. So, when you go to Valley Forge next time, when you think about Valley Forge, I would ask you to get rid of every tree that you see. They weren't there. 1, forge. You need fuel for the iron forges. 2, all fortifications need stabilizing pieces from wood. Guess what wood comes from? Trees. And that is the limit of my knowledge of trees. All I know is that all trees are made out of wood. Don't ask me any more about them. I'm a city boy from LA. But what you get here is getting rid of those trees. You now have fields of fire. It means I can shoot further. I don't know the mathematical formula. One of my students, who's an artillery officer, commanded a battalion of artillery, about 1,000 soldiers in the 82nd Airborne, tried to explain to me why higher elevation increases the range of artillery pieces. I asked him, Andy, please break it down for me like Barney. Talk to me like I'm a 3-year-old. It just didn't work. I'm a historian. Numbers, they make no sense to me. But you also get observation. The higher up I am, further I can see. You also get, as I say, this extended range. Higher ground means you dominate the terrain, so it makes it harder for the enemy to attack you. We call these things combat multipliers. Next slide, please. Redoubts, these small forts, they're all part of this much greater defense in depth and this defensive system that is FOB Valley Forge. You can see here, you've also got these strong points. Now, soldiers aren't manning these all the time. You'll have maybe a handful, but when the drummers beat the long roll, and that means get thy rear ends on the parade ground, form up in your regiments, form up to your assigned sectors, then they fall into where they're supposed to be. Next slide, please. Here's an inside. The Park Service has done a really nice job of reconstructing these readouts, and they give you a really wonderful representation of what this might have looked like. Although, by the way, I will tell you, besides getting rid of the trees, the site is much cleaner than it was. The site was filthy by the spring. Unfortunately, American soldiers in the 18th and 19th centuries were not the cleanest bunch of guys. And the number of orders that you see coming out from generals telling them, use the sinks, in other words, the latrines, do not evacuate thy bowels in front of the fortifications. I mean, some of these guys are they're like rocks. And I say that lovingly. So you've got this protected firepower. Next slide, please. At the base of Mount Joy, you've got mobile artillery. What they've done is concentrated much of the artillery for the main army at this location. The most mobile pieces would have been 6, maybe 8 pounders. And when I say pounder, that's the weight of solid shot. Basically a 6 to 8 pound iron cannonball, a bowling ball that you're going to shoot at a formation of soldiers that are massed. Ideal as an artilleryman, when you fire, you want grazing fire. So your cannonball bounces and ricochets on the ground and takes out multiple files of enemy soldiers. In every war in which this sort of artillery is used, in every army, and I've read dozens of accounts of these, there's always one or more soldiers who say, look, Sarge, watch me stop this. And he loses or gets a foot mangled. Stay away from rolling iron balls. They will hurt. Next slide, please. By February of 1778, the Army was on the verge of collapse. Washington writes to Brigadier General William Smallwood, who's got command of 2 brigades of Marylanders, plus the 2nd Canadian, or Congress's own, down at Wilmington, confessing that if the Army is not fed soon, it's going to have to disperse into the back country, places like Reading, maybe even Lancaster. And what does that do? It surrenders the initiative to the enemy. This army, the Continental Army, as well as the British Army, perform political functions. All warfare is about attaining political ends. It's about attaining certain ends that will improve the position of the combatants. Unless you're going out just for the simple bloody-minded pleasure of slaughtering your fellow human beings, war is about attaining political advantage or lessening a threat to your political situation. This Continental Army exists to challenge the British Army that's headquartered here in Philadelphia, to challenge British pretensions to the restoration of imperial rule in North America. Washington knows that so long as the Army exists, so long as the Army is at Valley Forge, the American Revolution, American resistance to British rule continues. The other bad option, soldiers are going to desert because we have not held up our end of the contract to feed them. He decides, I'm going to send out a foraging expedition to gather as much food and as many supplies as possible. This was the largest operation mounted by the Continental Army throughout the entire encampment. And for me as a historian, what a joy. Something that had not been done on its own. It was a blast. He knows that it's a risk. He's going to have to collapse his security line, pull back some of his combat-ready troops, and send them on a foraging expedition. But he also takes the measure of his opponent, General Sir William Howe. Howe and his army have spent most of the winter looking for food and supplies, not seeking combat. One reason they didn't seek combat is because of the strength of FOB Valley Forge. Howe, on the other side of that coin, realizes that the most valuable asset, the most important commodity that he has, is his soldier. Banish the thought of cannon fodder. That's a child's concept when it comes to the soldiers of this age. The officers and non-commissioned officers understood the value of their soldiers' lives, and they were not about to waste them in fruitless assaults. They were too valuable. They were too precious. The British Army's rule of thumb was to have 6 months of supplies on hand at all times. That only occurred 3 times during the 8 years of this war. So the British Army's desperately trying to feed itself, get firewood. Ideally, it should be spending the winter here in Philadelphia doing what all good 18th century armies do: drinking, whoring, gambling. That's a trinity. For those of you who know about Karl von Clausewitz, there's an opportunity here. He hears that through his intelligence network, this is Washington, that Howe is about to launch his own foraging operation. I want to beat him to the punch. Food becomes part of the battlefield. Deny the enemy food, deny his ability to sustain himself while feeding your own soldiers. Food becomes contested ground, as it were. Necessity. We've got to feed these guys or they're going to be gone. It's as simple as that. The payoff, we maintain our position at Valley Forge. We can continue to resist British rule. Next slide, please. Howe's got the A-Team. Now, I hate to disappoint you fans of Hamilton. It's actually Nathaniel Greene, the apostate Quaker who is Washington's right-hand man. When he wants something done that's tough, he sends Greene out to do it. Greene will get the job done as best he can. He's a good soldier. Under him, a local boy, Anthony, I'm not mad, Wayne. Wayne's one of the best combat commanders in this war. Yeah, he's something of a hothead. He's prideful. Nothing wrong with that. But he's also he exercises caution when he needs to. He gets it, in a word. Next to him, one of the best light cavalry officers of the war, Henry Lee Jr., who commands 5th Troop, 1st Continental Light Dragoons. And another local boy, granted from Ireland, but John Barry, who is a superb Navy officer. More people have heard of John Paul Jones. I wish they'd hear more about Barry. Barry and Wayne, I think, are brothers from different mothers. They're charged with take about 1,400 soldiers. I forget the number of fifers and drummers that he's supposed to bring, but those are also brought out. 4 pieces of artillery. March south, collect as many supplies as you possibly can. Send them off to the army. Greene doesn't believe it's going to work. He knows this area has been foraged over by both armies, but he's a good soldier. Washington gives him his orders. He salutes. Gotcha, boss. I will take care of it. As they march southward, Greene has quartermaster and commissary officers giving out certificates, compensate people for their goods that are impressed. Nobody wants to have an army nearby seizing their goods, but Washington was very cognizant of the role of property rights in this revolution. And so at least compensate them with a little bit of nothing rather than a whole lot of nothing. And that little bit of nothing was the Continental dollar. At one point, though, his men capture a couple of locals going into British lines, and his men seize them. Each one of them gets 100 lashes on his back for daring to bring supplies into British lines. Thou shalt not support the enemy, is Green's message. He's a tough customer. Farmers begin hiding their goods. Green decides, you know what? I'm not going to even give you receipts for things that I seize. If you hide your supplies, I'm simply seizing them. Some of his men, his foraging parties, will take hostages. Cough it up. He writes back to Washington, I hear their cries, and like Pharaoh, I harden my heart. He's not about to be trifled with. I don't know the exact numbers of what Greene was able to gather for the Army. Unfortunately, those account books are lost or hidden somewhere, and this project is a result of 10 years of labor on and off, so I was not able to find them. March, he decides, I'm going to cut Anthony Wayne loose. At first, it was going to be Colonel Richard Butler, commander of the 13th Pennsylvania Continentals, who lived in Carlisle, along with his brothers, the Fighting Butlers. And no, I'm not talking about fellows who come out, madam, you're served. But the Butler, good guy, solid officer, but Greene thinks this is too important a mission. Sends Wayne across. Wayne goes into New Jersey, works well with the local militia, gets great information. Same time, Henry Lee goes south, working in northern Delaware and also northeastern Maryland, sending back supplies, both of them acting really well. Wayne gets across the river because of John Barry, and he asks John Barry, after he ferries him across the river to Salem with about 300 soldiers, would you do me a favor and set fire to the marsh hay? Yes. I mean, look around at all the men in the room. Every one of us is a 14-year-old. Give us a box of matches, tell us to set fire to something, and we are happy. And if you can add explosives, that's even better. Barry does that, and he attacks British shipping. Next slide, please. There we go. General Howe's got the B team. Howe finally decides, now's my chance to act and have a slap at Mr. Wayne, which is what one of his Hessian aides de camp writes. So he's got Colonel Thomas Sterling commanding the 42nd Foot, better known as the Black Watch, 2 battalions strong. It's the size of a brigade. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Abercrombie with the Light Infantry Brigade, the elite of the British Army. Major John Graves Simcoe, who's with Sterling. Simcoe, for you fans of Turn, yet another disappointment from me. He's not a homicidal maniac. He's actually quite sane. And Captain Andrew Snape Hammond, who commands the Delaware River Squadron, right alongside the waterfront. They will go, and rather than seeking combat, well, they seek combat for a very short period. They ultimately lapse into foraging. They fall back into their old patterns of conduct. And this works out well for the Americans. There are a couple of combat actions, one in Haddonfield, New Jersey, about 6 miles from the river. Another one at Cooper's Ferry, today's Camden. Part of the battlefield, if you go to Camden, there is, I forget the exact location, but there is a bail bond office, which means, it means it's a nice neighborhood. It's boarded up, which means it's even nicer. That's where part of the skirmishing took place. Go there with a lot of friends in the daylight if you decide to venture forth. Next slide, please. So this foraging expedition comes out of Valley Forge. Lee is here at Scott's Farm. It ranges in all of these locations. That's a lot of cattle, a lot of swine, and a lot of horses being driven forward and gathered for the use of the Army. Washington shows here his acumen as a planner, but also the kind of team that he had built. He's able to send his subordinates out, and he trusts them. Here are your left and right limits. Here's how far I want you to go. Go no further. Get the job done. It's called trust, and that trust goes up and down and laterally. It's amazing to see the team that George Washington has built over a couple of years in one of the toughest schools around, the School of War. Next slide, please. The Delaware River, which might have given the British Navy, at least in theory, some advantage, it doesn't. Delaware River has a current that's too fast, plus the shipping channel runs along the Jersey side. You can't maneuver ships very well under power of wind, so they have to go slowly. You can't go as fast as you might. Everywhere on this river, British shipping is within range of American artillery. The British do not like that. Andrew Snape Hammond tells you right here in 1779, in front of Parliament, I don't know any river so difficult of navigation. So some of the technical stuff here. Next slide, please. I won't go through all the numbers. You can see that's a lot. Not every ration equals one mouth. Officers, depending on their ranks, get different rations, or I should say extra rations. Take care of servants, treat junior officers to dinner, and so on. These were compiled by historians Jacqueline Thibault and Wayne Bodle when they were at Valley Forge. They did superb work, and I can't thank them enough. Next, please. It takes about 113 wagons a day to feed the Army. There are only 8 wagons in camp. This Army starves amidst a land of plenty for a variety of reasons. Transportation breakdown, complicated purchasing system, you name it. Next slide, please. Cattle and horses and swine need to be fed. What goes in, by the way, comes out. Next slide, please. Also disease. Smallwood's brigade begins to, and this takes place in March, I believe, if I remember correctly, begins to slaughter about 100 head of cattle, feed his troops, or Smallwood's division, rather. They report that the cattle is basically dying on the hoof. It's rotting from the inside out. I believe it was rinderpest, a wasting disease. And as the commissary officers began having the cattle slaughtered, head after head was determined to be unfit for human consumption. 100 carcasses thrown into the Delaware River, 100 head of cattle that could not feed American soldiers. Next slide, please. A couple of things that I found. History is ultimately about human beings. Yeah, we talk about, at least in my case, the movements and decisions of generals. This one really touched me. These 2 small notes, faint pencil writing on notes about the size of a 3x5 card, from Anthony Wayne to Captain Theodore Woodbridge of the 7th Connecticut. Let's go to the next slide. To me, this really humanized it. I'd never heard of Captain Woodbridge. I hope he still has family in Connecticut. But for those who've forgotten him, this is my chance, and this sounds rather grandiose, and I don't mean it that way, my chance to give him back some life, at least on the pages of print. It also speaks, next slide please, it also speaks to the nature of the intelligence network and Wayne's ability to work with the local militia. Fantastic stuff. Next slide. History's about human beings, as I said. Every generation of historians asks new questions of the same old stuff. We want to understand who and what and why and how we are today because of who and what and why and how we were. Every real historian is a revisionist. Since Thucydides and Herodotus, every generation asks new questions. These are some of the men who served as wagon drivers. I'd finally found an account book at the Gloucester County, New Jersey Historical Society, Henry Lee's. And these are the wagon drivers whose names include Negro Joseph, Negro Sam, Negro Harry, Negro Jack, Negro David, Negro Cuff. The enslaved, the unfree, serving unwillingly in a cause for white political independence. History's uncomfortable. It's not about making us feel good or making us feel bad. It's about understanding who and what and why and how we are because of who and what and why and how we were. It's about self-knowledge and so much more. This tells me a lot about our collective American Revolution, our collective American war for independence. My ancestors at this time were in California, dispossessing the locals of their land and having some rather, I'm sure, brutal encounters, given the DNA. They were doing the same in Texas at the same time, and in what is today southern Arizona. But as an American citizen, it's still part of my story because we have not a background predicated upon race, ethnicity, or religion. The United States is founded upon an idea. That's why it's all of ours, whether your family was here or not. Next slide, please. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rick. It was fantastic. We have about 12 minutes for questions. There's a lot of folks here, so we'll try to get as many questions in as we can. We also have questions online. So if you have a question and want to get the conversation started, floor is open. All right, we've got one in the front.
The microphones are coming to you.
Coming to you.
I'll ask a very simple question. How many people are we talking about at Valley Forge?
They march in with about 12,000 soldiers. Other soldiers will go out and conduct patrols doing the same things that modern armies do. Or I should say modern armies are doing the same things that they were doing. And so you've got soldiers doing different duties in different places, but it's always several thousand, not all of them in the best of shape, not all of them the best equipped or armed. And they'll march out stronger, I forget the numbers, sure, in May and June when they lock horns with the British Army at Monmouth.
Can you tell me who did the cooking?
Here's my mess, my team of 8 soldiers. I'm one, here are the other 7. It's my turn today. It's Bob's turn tomorrow. It's Jim's turn the next day. And so you didn't have trained cooks. It's not until, if I remember correctly, about the 1870s that the Army establishes a baker's school, and you start to see soldiers who are trained to bake and cook. Even through the Civil War, it was your messmates who did the cooking, and not everyone was very good at it.
Some wars, there are women that follow the men.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand Martha Washington did travel to Valley Forge and entertain the officers' wives. So there was not much female help for the daily activity of the soldiers? You've got Martha Washington, also known as Lady Washington. She stays with the general at the encampment. And you also have some other senior officers' wives who will join them there. Rank did have its privileges. And this is the 18th century, and it's understood in a different light than we would understand it today. You also had laundresses in some cases, varieties of camp followers. There are also women who traveled with some of the sutlers, so civilians, who would who would sell things to the soldiers, extra supplies and what have you. 2 really good books on this, one by my dear friend Holly Mayer. I wish I could remember the name of the book. Forgive me, Holly, if you're hearing me. But it came out with the University of South Carolina Press, and then the other one is Following the Drum, and I think it's by Nancy Lone. Forgive me if I got her last name wrong. But those both look at women's roles, and there's much more to be explored. That is something that historians need to ask new questions of, because that is important. That's a microphone.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
My understanding is that most of the deaths at Valley Forge occurred from disease. Were there any deaths from starvation, or they just didn't get the food they needed?
I don't know of any from starvation,
But when you talk about disease, you're right on. I think if I remember my percentages correctly, or my ratios rather, it's something like in the 18th century, a ratio of 8 to 1. So for every soldier who dies directly in battle or from wounds received in battle, another 8 die from disease. When you look at casualty figures for the battles, I usually use a rough rule of thumb. Figure half of them will be dead within a couple of weeks because of the nature of medical care at that time. When you're struck by a slow-moving, large-caliber ball, a 69 from a French Charleville-style musket, or a 75 caliber Brown Bess, it is carrying with it not just the general filth, but also whatever tallow is on there, flecks of powder. It strikes your dirty uniform, brings in bits and pieces of your dirty wool uniform, your dirty shirt. And if your body has not been washed, and there's a good chance it brings in your dirty flesh as well. It strikes bones and turns them into shards that then move about and do what they will to your internal organs and muscles. It may or may not exit. The only answer in most cases is amputation. And this remains the same for nearly another century.
So the question here and then over there. Go ahead.
As the troops collected the food, what was left of the condition of families to feed themselves?
One of the things that takes, I appreciate that one, the officers were enjoined to leave enough for the families to sustain themselves. One of the things, as I said, that with Washington's recognition of property rights is that he realizes that this war was won for people's affections. If I can't get them on my side, at least try and avoid alienating them too much. So leave them with something. Don't make them too angry at us, because these are, after all, and they're thinking in the best possible circumstances, these are going to be our fellow countrymen, our fellow citizens of whatever it is that we happen to create out of this war. So try not to harm people too terribly much. Who's got the mic? Yes, sir.
You mentioned that Washington had already developed his team, as it were, and this is relatively early on in the war. How would you rank the winter at Valley Forge, Fort Monmouth, all of the battles? Where would you rank it as far as its weight and really being the key pivotal moment and kept the Army together and helped us win?
It's a vital piece. You think about. Okay, no offense to Philadelphia. I really like the city, but it's just a city. Continental Congress packs up its papers and says, bye-bye. Philadelphia's chief real significance is as a port city. Grain, hogs, everything else, even lumber that moves out of here and then moves out into the greater Atlantic world. It's also an entry point for goods coming from Europe and elsewhere. And so that's its real value. In the popular mind, though, it's the capital. And it matters. We can't lose our capital. Well, why not? And so Valley Forge matters because of this challenge to the main British Army, its ability to defy it and to keep post during not the most brutal winter. The ones that took place both before and after were far harsher. This all takes place during the Little Ice Age, which is a multi-century long period of global cooling and wild, violent variations in weather patterns. But it's important symbolically, and you also see here after the disasters, maybe disaster is too harsh a word, but after the defeats during the Philadelphia campaign, it's an important moment of resistance in the American mind. And so it's got incredible psychological and emotive import to people. And that too plays a role. Warfare is not just scientific, numbers and all that good stuff. It's also a struggle for people's affections, their hearts, as well as their minds.
Question in the back and then one more.
Okay, great.
So I loved your discussion about how every generation asked new questions of the past. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Valley Forge's own history as a site and in the American memory. Presumably, the Continental Army leaves in June 1778, and it just returns to farmland. At what point does Valley Forge become this kind of iconic winter transformation turning point in the Revolution? And then when do people start thinking about preserving it as something sacred and developing a park system around it?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. Well, it takes it a little while. It does return to farmland, although it is filthy. The Army has to move across the river to the Pauling farm because it is so foul. And so it moves across the Schuylkill, does eventually become that. You do see in the 19th century stories, many of them very embellished, coming out about Washington, about Valley Forge. There's a defensive action, for example, at Scott's Farm that Light Horse Henry Lee does incredibly well. And some fellow, whose name I forget, but it was published in South Carolina in the 1830s, 20s or 30s, he embellishes this story, and he has Bannister Tarleton there. He's got the villain of villains, Tarleton's Quarter, and all that good stuff. It's like, he wasn't there. So, but you see this accretion of myth and symbolism developing, and then it picks up with the centennial in 1876. And I don't know the exact date, but it's taken over by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as a park, and then eventually comes into federal government hands and preserves it, and it makes. And so you see this development of it into, if you will, a sacred place for Americans. Sacred, in a sense, civic sacredness, because it doesn't ask any religious belief. It simply draws upon our collective memory of who and what and why and how we were, and taking information from that and trying to understand us through that process, and so much more.
So I think we have one more question, and then we'll come to a close.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was just wondering, as it is my understanding, that not all Americans during that time were for the revolution. We did have loyalty to the crown at that time also. How did that affect like communication and supplies and the general communications?
Yeah, thank you. You'll notice I didn't use the term patriot. I'm a scholar of the American Revolution, the War for Independence. I do venture out on occasion. I will not use it because it's a loaded term, because the Loyalists were patriotic as well. It's the locus of their loyalty. They're loyal to crown, to king, to constitution. Their identity predicated upon belonging to the British Empire, being a subject of the British crown. The line that you hear from John Adams, a third, nah, not so much. I figure it may be closer to 40%, leave me alone. I want nothing to do with your war. Get away from me, both your armies, a pox on your houses. Maybe 30-30. I don't know the exact numbers. There weren't any polls being taken. But this was a civil war within the British Empire. It was a civil war within each colony, within each state. You also have a civil war being fought within the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Six Nations. So there are wars within this much larger war. It just started as a colonial rebellion, and look what it became. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rick.